The build-up of Russian forces on the Ukrainian border suggests that Russian President Vladimir Putin may be preparing for a new personal adventure. Some believe that it may not be far from his attempt to avoid the consequences of his foreign policy's setbacks in the many hotspots in which his country is involved. These setbacks are accompanied by internal tension, in light of worrying economic conditions, after his administration failed to remove the country from the dependence of its growth on oil, as well as the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the other hand, others believe that it may be the result of his sensing of the danger to the future, not only of his rule, in which he has built his authoritarian model since taking power in 2000, but also of the future of Russia's unity itself, in light of what the Ukrainian issue means to it. Talking about his demand for the United States and NATO for security guarantees on its western and southern borders, and to prevent the expansion of the alliance to those borders, is not enough to justify this tension. As for the doors of the alliance, Putin was the one who initiated its ways to join him, and the party that has been raising the level of tension with him has been his behavior since he took power. And the alliance did not undertake any military action or accelerated event, such as the intervention in Syria, or recently offered to open its doors to Ukraine's accession, or the European Union sought an economic and political partnership with Kiev, as happened in 2013. Even the talk that Putin's frustration is due to Ukraine's lack of commitment to the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015 granting the Russian-dominated Donbas region a veto over Ukraine's relationship with the West is not a new development. There is a big difference between the threat of military action and its implementation. And with regard to Russia and Ukraine, many believe that Vladimir Putin understands it. However, in statements by U.S. representatives of both Democratic and Republican parties, following their recent visit to Ukraine, they said that they are convinced that Putin was seriously considering invading it. As they demanded the administration of President Joe Biden to impose preventive sanctions on Moscow and send more weapons to Ukraine, one of them, Democratic Representative Seth Moulton, said, "We should be more busy deterring Putin than provoking him." He added, "If Putin invades Ukraine, he should know that during the next 5 minutes he will find it difficult to buy soft drink from a vending machine, not that NATO will call an urgent meeting to discuss its steps in the following weeks." However, Putin's escalation of his threats, and a number of Russian officials brandishing the use of tactical nuclear weapons in any confrontation with the Ukrainian army, are seen by some as a clear expression of his fears of the high cost that he will incur. The information confirms that Kiev obtained quality American weapons, according to Pentagon spokesman John Kirby, and that it used drones for the first time in its war with the separatists, which it obtained from Turkey. Moreover, given Russia's fragile economic conditions, Putin may be unable to finance a war. All data indicates that it will be a long and open war, which his country will not be able to bear. And his war in Syria is still evidence of the limits of what he can achieve, while maintaining a delicate balance of his involvement in it, his having to rely on his partner Iran to accomplish other dirty actions, and the impact it has on his leadership of the war in Syria and its future. In return for this escalation, Putin hastened recently to hold immediate negotiations or talks with the United States and NATO, about the guarantees that should be provided to Russia regarding its security and preventing any future expansion of the alliance to the east or the deployment of weapons systems that threaten Russia in Ukraine or any other neighboring country. There are those who say that Putin was shocked by the firm position of Washington and Western capitals, based on the premise that the experience of 2014 and 2015, when he invaded the Crimea and annexed it to Russia, will not be repeated. Likewise, from the statement of the Group of 7 major economic countries, which is completely biased towards Washington, in paying Russia a heavy price if it invades Ukraine. There, the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan reiterated, in a call with his Russian counterpart, Yuri Ushakov, that Washington will continue to coordinate closely with its European allies, in an effort to address security and strategic issues with diplomacy, which also revealed that Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs Karen Donfred, who visited Kiev and Moscow finally, it agreed with the NATO allies to unify and coordinate efforts in this file. This, and American circles talked about presenting an acceptable and balanced road map for both sides to get out of the crisis. While some hold former U.S. President Barack Obama responsible for his negligence in responding to the Crimean invasion, others believe that Obama's position was an implementation of policies that relax Washington from regional problems, in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Europe itself, after he described Russia as a regional power. It is an ideological rival, not a strategic threat like China. Rather, he allowed Putin to plunge into the quagmire of Syria, which he entered with a described American approval. Today, American analysts say that Biden will not repeat the policies of his predecessors, Obama and Trump, neither out of contempt nor favoritism, nor in exposing Russia to existential dangers. During the implementation of his competitive strategy with China, he is trying to lure Russia, under his administration, and betting on its inevitable impact on its democratic environment and its internal movement. He believes that despite the success of Putin's nationalist and populist policies in inciting a large part of Russian public opinion against America, the Russian people, with their different ethnic components, still aspire to join the ranks of the West, similar to the experiences of the peoples of Central Europe. The problem of history. Some raise historical problems that have long plagued decision-makers in Russia, since the establishment of Tsarism in 1470, through the Soviet era, all the way to the era of Putin. Russia, which was the country of the spider before the state, was and still is haunted by the obsession of returning to that era, if Ukraine, annexed by Tsar Ivan III, loses that year. During World War II, the Soviet believed that the invasion of Ukraine by Nazi Germany, with the aim of ripping it off from them, constituted the cornerstone of Germany's strategy to win the war on Russia. The robbery of Ukraine from Russia establishes the demise of Russia itself, and returns it to its previous formations of small states, as it was before the declaration of Tsarism. However, Germany's defeat, on the other hand, established a Russian doctrine, which was ultimately unsuccessful, calling for guaranteeing Germany's neutrality, in contrast to the fear that its neutrality and independence from the United States would lead to a revival of neo-Nazi ambitions, after Germany had returned to power tremendous economic. Needless to say, these policies not only led to the loss of Germany, which adhered more closely to the United States, but also to the collapse of the entire Soviet experience, as well as the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the accession of most of its countries to NATO. Some believe that this doctrine still dominates the Russian mind, in an attempt to ensure the neutrality of Ukraine, which may explain the reasons for Putin's adherence to Ukraine, and what it means for the unity of Russia itself, and not for ideological, economic, or competitive reasons with the West. In an article published last July, titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians," Putin argued that the two countries constituted one people and that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. Now, in his third decade of rule, Putin may consider that unless decisive action is taken, Ukraine will move further away from Russia. But if this is the case, some are wondering about the future of this doctrine, which turns out that its realization requires the availability of many factors, certainly not military. The Soviet Union, which was the global pole vis-a-vis the United States, did not protect its military arsenal from collapse. After obtaining a pack of Marlboro cigarettes became a dream for the Russians. The scale of anger at the former Soviet model, and today's model of Putinism, not only in Ukraine and the countries of the former socialist camp, but also within Russia, threatens separatist tendencies that may topple its own unity. Russia, which is unable to break the backwardness of its political and economic model, and the obstruction of its progress, needs to get out of these policies, despite Putin's foreign successes, from the U.S. elections, to strengthening right-wing nationalist tendencies in the European continent. The countries that have emerged from the mantle of Moscow, whose democratic progress has opened the horizon towards a future, may be promising, at least if we look at the achievements of small European countries. not to mention South Korea, Taiwan, and some Southeast Asian countries, which were a competitive field with the United States. But today, Russia is light years ahead of economic and technological progress. The researchers struggle to find any Russian product, other than the S-400. Some analysts believe that Russia's push into the arms of China may lead to a greater strategic mistake. It does not only threaten its subordination to it, in light of Beijing's superiority in various economic and technical fields. Rather, it may be open to strategic and economic factors looming on the short and medium horizon, about the possibility of an economic collapse that China is actively heading towards, after the outbreak of the real estate crisis in it, the slowdown in production and the start of major international investors and producers to search for new supply chains. This undoubtedly plays a major role in Beijing's reluctance to enter into the adventure of reclaiming Taiwan by force. What will it gain from its destruction? Consequences of taking shelter in China. Some Western analyses add that the Russian and Chinese insistence on adhering to the policies of threat and annexation could backfire. Before Russia annexed Crimea, Ukraine felt torn between the West and Russia. After that, Ukraine began to move steadily towards the West in geopolitics. Likewise, China's crackdown on Hong Kong has strengthened positions in Taiwan against peaceful reunification, along the one country, two systems model. But analysts also warn that these factors may strengthen Putin's desire to invade in response to anti-Russian sentiment. And then the adventure will be great if Russia does not defeat the Ukrainian forces quickly, in a country with a population of more than 40 million people, and most of it bears historical feelings hostile to Russian control. The conflict may be prolonged, as Western military aid flows into Ukraine, and then the expected civilian casualties and destruction of property may inflame public opinion, even in the separatist eastern part of Ukraine, which could lead to an insurgency. Then Russia would not be able to resort to official denial, as it has done since its annexation of Crimea, while Ukraine would simply say it was leading a national uprising, not a conflict over a disputed piece of land. How deteriorated Russian relations with the West. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and years of attempts at rapprochement between Russia and the West, its President Vladimir Putin in 2000 tried to move quickly to strengthen those relations, and test the possibility of Russia joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, but Lord George Robertson, who held the position of Secretary-General of the alliance between 1999 to 2004, he finally recalled how Putin asked him when the alliance would invite Russia, and how insulted the latter was, when Robertson replied that Moscow should apply for membership, just like any other country, according to the Associated Press. While exploring the possibility of joining NATO, Putin has also moved to forge closer political and security ties with Washington and its allies. He was the first foreign leader to contact U.S. President George W. Bush after the September 11 attacks in 2001, offering to help. He quickly welcomed the U.S. military deployment to the bases of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia for the war in Afghanistan. Putin also closed Soviet-era bases in Cuba and Vietnam. Although Russia did not join NATO, it agreed with it in 2002 to establish a Council for Policy Coordination and Cooperation in combating terrorism and other issues. But since that year, relations between Moscow and Washington began to deteriorate, after the latter decided to withdraw from a Cold War-era treaty banning the deployment of anti-ballistic missile defenses, a move Moscow viewed as a potential threat to its nuclear deterrent. Then, the U.S. war in Iraq in 2003 provoked severe criticism from Moscow, and further strained relations. Moscow's anger escalated when Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, joined NATO in 2004. With the outbreak of the Orange Revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia, which toppled the Russian-backed presidential candidate in Kiev, and the Georgian president backed by it also in that year, the Kremlin viewed those protests as Western interference in Russia's backyard. Putin's speech at a security conference in Munich, Germany in 2007 constituted a watershed and severe criticism of the U.S. moves. He said that Washington exceeded its national borders in every way, describing NATO's eastward expansion as a dangerous provocation. When NATO, at a summit in Romania in 2008, promised Ukraine and Georgia to join it, Russia viewed this as a blow to its vital security interests. 4 months later, Russia launched a 5-day offensive on Georgia, following the latter's attempt to regain control of the Moscow-backed separatist province of South Ossetia. Then, in 2014, popular demonstrations ousted Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, a friend of the Kremlin, in protest of his abandonment of an agreement with the European Union, in favor of closer relations with Moscow. Moscow responded by annexing Crimea and supporting separatist rebels in the industrial and mining region of eastern Ukraine, known as the Donbas Basin. The conflict, which entered its 8th year, killed more than 14,000 people, and failed efforts to reach a political settlement. Then Washington and its allies imposed sanctions on Moscow, suspended all cooperation with NATO, and deployed military reinforcements near Russia. The Kremlin has since denounced the deployment and the exercises near its border, describing them as a security threat. And last month, tensions escalated after intelligence reports and satellite imagery of Russia massing some 170,000 soldiers and military equipment near Ukraine. While Putin has denied planning an attack on Ukraine, he is seeking a Western pledge that NATO will not include it in its membership or deploy its forces there, an expansion he described as a red line for Moscow. At a virtual summit between Putin and Biden last week, the U.S. president warned of serious consequences if Russia invaded Ukraine, but promised to hold consultations to address Russian concerns, at the same time repeating the position of NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, who refused to have Russia any role in determining who will join NATO. The build-up of Russian forces on the Ukrainian border suggests that Russian President Vladimir Putin may be preparing for a new personal adventure. Some believe that it may not be far from his attempt to avoid the consequences of his foreign policy's setbacks in the many hotspots in which his country is involved. These setbacks are accompanied by internal tension, in light of worrying economic conditions.